It's week 32 of the Bible Challenge, and we're continuing through Isaiah the prophet. We'll also be finishing 1 Thessalonians, going through all of 2 Thessalonians, and into the first letter of Paul to Timothy. The Psalms this week are Psalms 28 through 33, and you can find outline summaries for the Psalms in the Bible Challenge for weeks 5 and 6. Last week, we had an overall introduction to Isaiah and went through the first 6 chapters. As we noted last week, chapters 6 through 9 basically comprise Isaiah's memoirs, his narrative of his call. Now we have his encounter with King Ahaz and the sign of Emmanuel as the prominent elements in the narrative. The prophecy of the sign of Emmanuel, which means God with us, that's the meaning of the name. The prophecy is issued in chapter 7 here, and we start out with the famous verse 14 that is quoted in Matthew at chapter 1, verse 23, and certainly famous to us from Handel's Messiah. And that is, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child." Now, in the Hebrew manuscript, the word used is alma. This is also found at Genesis 24:43, Exodus 2:8, and Psalm 68:25. In the Hebrew, this is generally translated as a young girl or maiden, and it includes an assumption of virginity. Matthew, in quoting the verse at Matthew 1:23, quotes from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where the word is rendered as parthenos. Now, the Septuagint usage, the Greek usage, is more clearly associated with the term virgin. And Isaiah's point seems to be, as well as Matthew's, who certainly knows the Hebrew, that God is acting directly in this sign given by the prophet. There is no human agency here outside that of the Virgin herself. The references to the Prince of Peace and to Zebulun and Naphtali, which we encounter in chapter 8, are references to people under Assyrian oppression. These are the northernmost tribes. They are to be delivered by the successor of Ahaz as the righteous king conceived of the Virgin, as the Emmanuel. The messianic nature of this figure is therefore clear. The figure is one anointed by God. In chapters 9 through 12, we encounter prophecies regarding Judah and Israel. The focus is on the fact that the Lord reaches out to all of his people. He is the true ruler, and the prophet therefore utters a series of woes against oppressive rulers, in other words, false rulers. The prophet does foresee a righteous king in the future, and the advent of this righteous earthly ruler will result from the righteousness of God. Now, the balance of the chapters that we'll encounter this week, except for chapter 24, which is the last one we'll encounter this week, consists of oracles against the nations. We can translate nations as peoples, as Gentiles, in other words, people who are not Jewish, whether or not we consider these political entities or just ethnic groupings. Notable in these oracles is that found at chapter 14, verses 1 to 2, as an oracle against Babylon. Israel's restoration is a corollary to Babylon's downfall. However, the restored Israel will be so esteemed by others that she will, or he will, the others will want to join Israel. They will want to come and be a part of Israel. The clear meaning here is that those who were captive will now possess those who held them, those who were their captors. In chapter 24, we switch gears, and we're going to deal with chapters 24 through 27, basically. We'll take this more up next week, but this is what's called the apocalypse of Isaiah. Following the oracles against particular nations, the prophet now speaks of the end times for all the earth. The themes of judgment of evil, end of death, and resurrection of the dead betray this section as later in composition than the surrounding chapters. Prophecy and prayer alternate in the narrative of the Lord's triumph. And we'll continue in the Apocalypse of Isaiah next week. As we look at the last chapter, chapter 5 here of Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, we of course have to go back to what we said last week about the overall nature of the letter as the earliest example of Christian writing that we have. In chapter 5 here, where Paul is continuing his discourse on eschatology, on the theology of end times, which began in chapter 4. And he's concluding with final exhortations to order in the Christian community, an expression of personal wishes and a salutation. We have to compare verses 1 to 11 in chapter 5 as a complement to verses 13 through 18 in chapter 4, whereas Paul had spoken of the second coming, the parousia. Here he reflects on the fate of those who are alive at the end of the age, the eschaton, from which we get the term eschatology. In referring to the end of time, Paul uses the scriptural term from the Old Testament, the day of the Lord, which could be found, for example, at Amos 5:18, Joel 2:1, or Zephaniah 1:7. There are themes of light and darkness here, used to distinguish those who live in Christ and those who do not. Christians are involved in a final eschatological confrontation. Therefore, they are to arm themselves with the Christian virtues and grace. And so we get this imagery of a warrior's equipment as an echo of Isaiah 59:17. Paul is concerned that believers be prepared and that the Christian community be built up. It is not enough for him that individuals have faith. Faith has to be lived actively in community. This general exhortation to faith and community is followed by a series of short instructions to those in particular stations in life. In other words, Christian charity must be put into practice. Which takes us to the second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians. Now, this second letter to the community in Thessalonica is believed by most scholars to have been written by another one writing in Paul's name and at a later date. This conclusion is reached on the basis of textual evidence, variations of vocabulary and style, and variations in message about the end times. This practice, as we've discussed before, of a disciple writing in the name of his master was common in the ancient world and was considered to express a high degree of adherence to the teaching of the master. The nature of the text and the manner in which it follows the argument of 1 Thessalonians indicate that the author of 2 Thessalonians is likely to have had a copy of 1 Thessalonians available. Excuse me. The purpose of 2 Thessalonians seems to be to discredit the claims of apocalyptic preachers who are claiming that the end times are here, they're causing alarm in the community, and they're causing social unrest. Now, while 1 Thessalonians certainly did include some apocalypticism, some discussion of end times, 2 Thessalonians seems to be a corrective written by Paul or another, intended to deal with a misinterpretation of parts of 1 Thessalonians. People have been preaching a sort of doomsday scenario. We can outline the letter as involving a greeting and an opening thanksgiving, a prayer. The prayer and opening formula together reflect the instruction that persecution is a test leading to God's glory in judgment. Then we get an argument about the proper understanding of the parousia, the second coming, the triumph of the Lord over deception, and a prayer for strengthening of the faithful. Finally, the letter closes with exhortations, prayers, and greetings. So a much shorter letter, much simpler letter than 1 Thessalonians. We also continue now into the first letter of Timothy. Now, by now you're probably tired of hearing me say that various scholars say this was not written by Paul or likely not to be written by Paul. Again, when we look at the issue of authorship and pseudonymous writing, does it really matter? If we go back to the earliest days in the church, there were people in place who were in a much better position than modern scholars to judge whether or not a letter was authentically Pauline or not. Pauline in terms of the thought. The fact that they included it, and the fact that they included it knowing how people wrote in others' names, would say this is consonant with Paul's theology, is an extension of his argument, can be read with his other letters, whether or not his hand wrote the letter. It does follow the general Pauline form, but this is a pastoral letter. That is one written to a specific Christian leader. Pastoral letters are written to specific people or specific congregations. What are called Catholic letters are written to the entire church, because the word Catholic in Greek means universal. So that's a letter written to everybody, like 1 Peter or Hebrews, for example. The form here is an opening salutation with offers of grace and peace, a thanksgiving for the witness of the recipients, the message, which can include argument and or answers to specific questions which have been posed by the recipients, and a conclusion and final greeting, which usually includes some personal advice, ending with a blessing. As I say, most scholars would say this letter was probably not written by Paul. If he wrote it, it would be at the last year of his life, around the year 65. If it was written by another, it probably dates from about 85 to 95. And some would even date it later because of some similarities in style and thought with the first letter of Ignatius, which was written in 110. 1 Timothy, as well as 2 Timothy and Titus, clearly rely doctrinally on Romans and 1 Corinthians. So the genuinely Pauline thought found in Romans and 1 Corinthians is extended in 1 Timothy, regardless of authorship. The content of the letter is focused on warning Timothy, warning any person called to leadership in the church to guard against false teaching and false teachers, using Paul's career and teaching as a model. The letter is stated in terms of a charge, therefore, which includes details on the ordering of worship, the office of bishop, that of the deacon, encouragement of pastors in teaching. Instructions are given for additional persons in the church according to their station, for example, widows or elders or slaves for that matter. Remember, this is old world slavery, not new world chattel slavery. Paul makes it clear here that it is God's desire that every human being be saved. His instruction, therefore, focuses on how we are to respond to God's intention. And the instruction can be specific. It can involve things as specific as posture in prayer. It can be specific as to classes of persons, for example, women in worship. Now here's where we get some problematical language about women exercising a teaching role, speaking in church. Paul clearly does not express any reservation about women praying in community, but there is a reservation about a teaching role here, and this would appear to conflict with Paul's recognition of responsible roles for women in the church. For example, that of Phoebe as deacon at Romans 16:7, or Prisca at Romans 16:3, 1 Corinthians 16:19, Junia at Romans 16:7, and as women have been depicted as preaching at 1 Corinthians 11:5 and teaching at Acts 18:26. This conflict may be evidence of an author other than Paul at a later date who is more focused on the discipline in the church as the church starts turning more into an institution. The parallels here are actually greater with what's called the Didache, a first-century manual of church conduct in Asia Minor. There are greater parallels to the Didache in this section than to other sections of Paul's writing. And the teaching regarding bishops in chapter 3 here both seems to draw on an earlier list of qualifications, and so may be based on some traditions that independently gave rise to the didicake. There's a lot going on here that's not in the written record. We cannot ignore any admonition in Scripture and line through it and act like it doesn't exist, but neither can we read it by itself. And we have to look at the many other places where Paul discusses the role of women in the church to put this verse in proper context. May you be blessed in your continued study of God's holy word, and we will meet again next week, week 33, to continue through Isaiah and the letters to Timothy. God bless.